You're listening to Not Tell Me Something Weird. This is Cool and Unusual Punishment. If you think to yourself, or if you've thought to yourself, oh man, I really enjoyed Tell Me Something Weird. What happened to them from January and then one time in July? Well, what happened is we're not doing this show anymore. We had what's called creative differences. And so I thought to myself, I really like the idea of telling weird stories to somebody else, and they telling me weird stories, and then we talk about them. And then it was like, I happen to live with somebody who could do that with me. So we're doing a new podcast, and this is our first episode. And we're called Cool and Unusual Punishment with Tyler Haas.
Hi. Yeah, I feel like we should establish our relationship at the top of this.
Mm-hmm.
So, just to put any rumors to rest.
That yes, we are sleeping together.
We are currently sleeping together.
And we're getting married.
Also that. Yeah, I was very, very envious of your show and very confused to see it go. And I thought, well, what if I could insert myself into this somehow? And here we are.
I was thinking that for a long time.
Also, I feel like I should point out, in the interest of full disclosure, that the title of our show is from a NoFX song. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I feel like I have to clear my conscience by pointing it out.
Yeah, that this is now the second podcast where you've taken lyrics from a song.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, this is our first episode. I already have acknowledged earlier today that first episodes of most anything aren't the best. This is the pilot, if you might say. But the idea of the show is I like true crime. It's not always going to be Wisconsin-based, but sometimes you tell me weird things all the time that you find in stories. And how many times have I sent you things and been like, oh, this would be great for your show. But then it's like, well, it would be great for our show, right?
Yeah. And in regards to this being our pilot episode, I would remind you that Riker doesn't grow the beard until season 3.
That's right.
Until season 2 or 3, Kramer isn't like a hipster doofus. He's just kind of an asshole neighbor. So it takes time for the characters to. Mm-hmm. We'll figure out what our respective roles are. Who's the baby face and who's the heel of this show, and that'll just come in time.
Anyway, I have something to tell you about. Would you had something to say?
No, I was trying to think of a funnier way to say, tell me something weird.
Well, this isn't the full, I'm not going to go into my story.
Okay. You got a little
teaser.
A little nugget.
The Ukrainian orphan who is actually maybe an adult has been found in Indiana. Screenshot. Orphan. This is what the story has. Of course, this is Jezebel.com, a very reliable website.
It sounds like you're about to either bully a child or disrespect an adult human being.
The story of the 6-year-old Ukrainian orphan who may or may not have actually been a murderous adult has raised many, many questions among those fascinated by her case. But the most pressing one is definitely, where is she now? Well, good news for us, Natalia has been found, and she's living with another family in Indiana. Natalia Barnett is living with a Christian couple who consider her their teen daughter, as the tabloid put it, but depending on whom you believe, the bubbly baby-faced youngster is either a 16-year-old girl or a 30-year-old sociopath masquerading as a child. Okay, so she was found abandoned.
Hold on, can I just jump in? This is the plot of the movie The Orphan, right? I don't know my horror movies too well, but I think...
I have not seen that. Is this an Angelina Jolie joint?
Yeah, I think all the movies I bring up are this is the common thread through them all. No, I think that's the it's like this murderous child, and the twist is you find out it's like a 30-year-old.
Really? Well,
Yeah.
then I didn't know
Are you
anything.
reading the synopsis to a movie right now? Well, if it's a true story, that's even
Yeah,
crazier,
she was
so.
found abandoned in an apartment 2013 after her former adoptive family, the Barnetts, moved to Canada without her. But contrary to what one may think, the Barnetts didn't abandon Natalia because of her alleged habit of trying to poison their coffee with bleach or standing over them while they were sleeping. They simply concluded she was actually an adult.
They came across her driver's license, and they're like, I think...
They concluded she was actually an adult with a rare form of dwarfism, posing as a child. And after helping her come up with a plan to get her life together, they left her behind. So then enters this Christian family. They applied to become her legal guardians, though they withdrew that petition when the court upheld an earlier ruling that she was born in 1989, not 2003. Even if she's an adult, the man seemed to have determined that they're committed to her. So...
I don't know if left behind is the right term. If you discover she's an adult, it's like saying you left your roommate behind when you moved out. Like, you didn't abandon anyone. Once it's an adult, it's two roommates going separate ways. It's not.
So this is a classic Benjamin Buttons situation. Right? Isn't that kind of what happened there? That's a different thing. That was...
Yeah, it is magic.
So this girl had this history, right? And so there's a family friend who has this quote, "I'm not a doctor or a psychiatrist, but I've spoken with Natalia and I believe her. If you're asking me if I think she's 30, that's ridiculous." And
it sounded like you read some point. So another family adopted her, and like they believe she's a teenager. Like, this doesn't seem like something that you, just like we all agreed on 13, and we're comfortable with that. It feels like it shouldn't be left up to what each person believes. Seems like there'd be a very easy way to figure this out. Like.
Here's listen to the first comment on this story. Wait, from Chief Queef.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, is this a thing? I once had a 15-year-old boy in my summer class who made me feel uneasy for some reason I couldn't put my finger on, and he turned out to be a 22-year-old Ukrainian national who'd overstayed his visa and was paying some family to adopt him. He's now in prison on a bunch of charges. It's like, what the hell? So there's this girl who also tried to push her family into a fireplace. She tried to poison their coffee. She stood over them while they were... You saw the movie?
Yeah.
So these things happen like this in the movie? I
mean, we'd have to watch again. I don't know if she's Ukrainian, but it's like she tries to kill their other kid. And it's like, this child is so hard to control. And then they find out she's an adult serial killer or something.
Oh my God. Well, maybe this whole story is just based on this pretend.
That's what I'm wondering about, because I feel like there's not follow-up in the places where there needs to be.
I mean, I just found it on Jezebel, which was on my Facebook feed, and I was like, save, and this could all be fake, so sorry about it. Maybe it's fake. Do you have something to tell me before? I had one more thing I want to read to you, but I'd like for you to tell me a story.
So I want to tell you the story, and I want to start by saying,
is this your story? Like, is this what you're going to tell me?
Yeah, I didn't prepare supplementary material.
Okay, because I was going to tell you about the Lake Michigan Triangle, but it's fine. We can say that for next time.
Well, okay. I wanted to say I want to say this to you and any Tell Me Something Weird listeners who might find their way to this podcast. I don't know. I didn't listen to every episode of your show, so I don't know what stories have been covered. I don't know if you or the listeners have heard some of these stories.
I mean, I'm doing a repeat.
So, okay. I mean, I was torn between asking, like, if you've heard this, let me know. But maybe you shouldn't do that, because I don't have anything else if you've heard it. So, I apologize if this has been covered already. Are you familiar with, do you know what a spite fence is?
A spite fence?
A spite fence?
No.
A spite fence refers to a fence that's
Place for property owners to piss them off?
Yeah, it tends to be like a fence that's uncommonly tall. It's used by one neighbor annoyed by his neighbor, by his next door neighbor, or in order to piss that person off. It's a fence built to obstruct views, like purely out of spite.
Yeah. This maybe actually was covered on our show, although I feel like it was more like, sorry, I have to get some whiskey. I think it was something, well, let me hear it.
So I want to tell you the story about, maybe the best spite fence of all time. Or the worst, depending on whose side you're on. The year is 1876.
Okay, so I see you've listened to enough Tell Me Something Weirds to know that's my absolute favorite decade.
It's where black and white is just starting to turn to sepia. It's really the best kind of era.
I thought you were going to talk about race relations. It's where black and white.
We're getting rid of racism. Like, oh boy. So 1876, the Transcontinental Railroad has just been built. It has been built by
the Chinese.
By the Chinese, and they'll come back in the story. But the Big Four, as they were called, the four railroad barons who were kind of responsible for financing this.
Yes.
They were Charles Crocker, Leland Stanford, Collis Potter Huntington, and Mark Hopkins. They, according to the articles I read, referred to themselves as the Associates, which is kind of lame. They're known publicly as the Big Four. So they've just completed this railroad. They're rich beyond their wildest dreams. Mm-hmm. And they decide they're going to settle in San Francisco. This is also around the time, I believe, of like the gold rush. California is a hot spot. They decide on this neighborhood in San Francisco at like the top of the highest hill, which would come to be known as Nob Hill.
Yeah, I've been there.
Okay. And they, so two of these guys, I think Leland Stanford and Mark Hopkins, both build enormous mansions on the top of this hill. It is the most bougie thing they could do. They are richer than God. This is where they're going to lay their claim. And so Charles Crocker, the third of the Big Four, decides he also wants to be a part of this. So he starts scoping out some land on the top of Nob Hill, and he decides he's going to build his mansion on this entire city block. That's where his mansion is going to be. And so to go about doing this, he starts slowly and sort of quietly buying up all the property on this block. And so he's going around sort of secretively taking over these properties, getting his mansion square. And he runs into a problem in that there's one guy who won't sell his house. His name is Nicholas Young. He's a German immigrant who arrives in the U.S. in 1848. He establishes a mortuary business.
And this was in the 1870s?
Yes, when these mansions start going up, it's in the 1870s. Nicholas Young arrived about 30 years earlier. He's an undertaker. He builds this small cottage on the top of this hill for his family, and he's been living there for quite a while. And he is the only person on this block who won't sell his house.
Where is it situated on the block? Do you know?
It is.
Is it in the middle of everything?
It is. Not. Its place will become important a little later.
Okay,
but
so I won't ask.
It is on this block, and it is the only place that won't sell. So it is a problem just by virtue of it being on this block. And it's a lot of the articles try to it's hard to say who's to blame here, who is the bad guy.
I've definitely not heard the story before. What a relief.
So newspaper reports.
I'd sworn to not faking it with you, and I didn't want to have to start with the story. Okay, sorry.
Newspaper reports at the time said he was offered $3,000, $6,000, $9,000. It's unclear how much he was offered and if he was Like, was he being a cheapskate, or was he stubbornly sticking to his family cottage that he's had? In any case, he doesn't sell. And in the meantime, while Charles Crocker, while he's trying to buy this land, he starts building the mansion everywhere else on the city block. And that involves leveling off the land to build the mansion on. And that means lowering the land. They're blowing it up with dynamite. And some newspaper reports say that Charles Crocker is telling his workers to aim the dynamite blast to throw the rubble onto this guy's house.
This reminds me of the person who lives on the Cadott golf course.
Is that real? Is that a thing?
There's a golf course in Cadott when you're going on 29, and there's one house on there. Anyway.
I mean, I started reading the story, and it's like, I know whose side I'm on. And it's this poor undertaker. Like, I don't care what his reasons were, but this guy who has all this money and can do anything can't get rid of this German immigrant undertaker, and he's throwing dynamite debris at him. He's not moving. What ends up happening is that they level off all the land except for this house, which is now raised up on its own plateau of land because everything else has been leveled off, and he's still not selling. All the dynamite blasts, all the noise, all the construction. He has at this point decided he's planted his flag and he is not moving.
And he doesn't have to sell. This isn't an eminent domain situation.
Right. So
I'd be miserable, though. I mean, I'm all for this, but also, God, wouldn't it suck to be living there?
And so what happens is Charles Crocker goes back to him, makes him another offer, one last offer, and he turns that down as well. And so Charles Crocker does, in his frustration, is he has his workers, he spends $3,000 to have his workers construct a wooden fence around 3 sides of this guy's house because his house faces the road. On the other 3 sides, they build a 40-foot wall all around his house. And so because it's not a corner lot, because it's covered on 3 sides by this enormous fence, it only gets like 2 hours of sunlight. He's essentially like buried in this wall that this guy builds. And he describes it as like being at the bottom of a well, and they like all his plants die, but at this point he's just in it. He's ride or die.
He's not having a good time. But I get it. But also this isn't how you want to be living.
No, but I mean at this point he's the bravest. Like, this guy is sticking it to the man, like with his little plot of land. And so the newspapers pick up on this because it's kind of a sight and becomes a sort of tourist attraction.
Oops. I'm adjusting.
It is decided that the spite fence that he's built is legal, but the newspapers write these stories like they're not on Charles Crocker's side. They start describing like this brave little man, and he's just buried under this fence, you know. Like,
how tall is the fence again?
40 feet. And I will show you a picture at the end of this, and we'll
post it on our Facebook page, which is upcoming.
So in the middle of this, he's trying to come up with ways he can fight back. He threatened to install a flagpole that would fly a skull and crossbones, an act of defiance that might help blight Crocker's view. He also wanted to place a coffin on his roof, ostensibly for advertising his business, but clearly to agitate Crocker as well. The newspapers started writing about this, and they were calling it Crocker's crime, and criticized the financier for using his immense wealth to bully a family of more modest means. The San Francisco Chronicle later called it, quote, a memorial of malignity and malevolence. So at this point, a third party comes in, and it will become clear very quickly that they're not as heroic as they might seem. This sort of political, the sort of activist group comes to Nicholas Young's side. They're called the Working Man's Party of California.
Okay, that sounds like a predecessor of any group advertising for any piece of shit You know what I mean? Republican Party thing.
So they come to his side because he's this little guy. They're trying to fight against this huge capitalist monster bullying the little guy. Also, their motto is "The Chinese must go." So,
okay, the Chinese.
They're against Charles Crocker because of his wealth and his capitalism, but also because he is bringing in these Chinese who were working on the railroad, and there are some heavy racist overtones in their party's movement. But they decide that this Nicholas Young is a guy they can get behind. They can stage rallies for his cause, and they do just that. They go to his house and they start holding rallies outside the mansion around this guy's house. On October 29th, 1878, the WPC holds a mass rally on the top of Nob Hill. They bring lime barrels and set them on fire, and there's like thousands of these guys surrounding the mansion, and inside the mansion are these armed guards ready for this riot, and they this is a mixed message, and I understand that, but this is what the rallying cry was. Their leader, Dennis Kearney was his name. He says,
sounds Irish,
at this rally, quote, "When the Chinese question is settled, we can discuss whether it would be better to hang, shoot, or cut the capitalists to pieces."
Oh.
He told the crowd that if Crocker didn't remove the spite fence by Thanksgiving Day, Kearney and the WPC would tear it down themselves. However, that battle didn't actually take place because 2 days after that, Kearney wasn't arrested for inciting a riot. So his battle never happened. The WCP or WPC didn't rally 2 days later or on the Thanksgiving Day. And shortly after that, Young would sell his land to Crocker. However, it's a sad ending with a good twist. He would sell the land and Crocker would get his mansion. However, just a few years after that happened, in 1906, the Great Fire of San Francisco swept through and destroyed the mansion. Today, there's now the Grace Cathedral stands in the spot where his mansion was. And I will show you a picture of, you can't see his house, but the fence in the background there is where.
Let me. Oh my God, that's awful.
It's the kind of person I wish I could be if the circumstances were a certain way, that with a man with no recourse to power at all, like all he can do is not sell his land, and he sticks it out for so long.
I have not heard that story. I have heard Spite House stories and whatever. I personally feel very happy that the fire happened.
Yeah, that's the little man tried his best, and then when he lost, God stepped in and just swept the capitalists down the hill.
Oh, that's what you're going to go with, God stepping in?
Yeah. Well-known communist.
Yeah. Whatever happened to that guy with the little house?
He sold the property, and that was where he exits the story. I don't know where he went from there.
Where'd you find this story? Where did you find this story?
I don't want to reveal things like that.
I'm good with it.
I'm just going back to the first episode of Tell Me Something Weird. I'm going to take each of Eric's stories one by one and fold them into my own and wait till you notice.
I do recall hearing something at some point about some obnoxious thing, but I feel like it was a house or something else. And there was a person right here in Eau Claire that like painted their house pink or purple. At some point when I was an undergrad in college, there was a house on Water Street that was painted a very obnoxious color. I think it's now a house that's currently like a weird wood paneling, if you recall a house. Mm-hmm. at some point that house was a very obnoxious color. I can't say for sure what color, but the owner just did it as a fuck you. Painted it that color, and I think at some point it became a problem. But you had asked me one day about driving down Water Street in Eau Claire. And as I was driving down, I realized that I think it is mostly shitty rentals that probably house about 4 or 5 people. So if 4 or 5 people pay $200, they're probably getting $1,000 rent a month for pieces of shit houses.
Yeah. No, I have no illusions about how college housing works, but I always wondered if there is, like, if you are a landlord of a house that's on Water Street, if you're allowed to pump up those numbers 300%, because like if you got a house on Water Street, that's you can do some sidewalk, overseeing. You just like, hey, we're just playing beer pong in the front yard. We're just a couple cool guys playing beer pong, and action comes to us.
Saturdays are for the boys. So I'm going to tell you about something that straight up, I'm going to be honest. Can I tell you about something that nobody else is going to care about, but I'm drunk and I want to tell you about it? Mm-hmm. Let me preface this by saying, we live together, and we live in an apartment complex of sorts, and there is
we sleep in the same bed.
Huh? There's not wood. There's a dirt mound in our courtyard that's been dug up by somebody, and my neighbor and good friend Pam put a hand in it.
They had dug up some dirt, and then when they filled the hole back in and leveled it off, she put a Halloween prop hand in the dirt. Right.
Well, it turns out, you'll probably hear over time, we have another neighbor who's a major narcissist, and I won't get into it right now, but she's friends to a neighbor across the courtyard. That neighbor across the courtyard has been having a panic attack tonight on account of this pretend hand. She thought it was like a real person. like anybody who is going to bury somebody in a newly dug mound of dirt was going to leave their hand out. It's like, shut up. I don't know what to say.
Well, it sounds like a ridiculous thing to believe, but there are things that have happened here that are very true, that if you told them, you'd be like, well, that doesn't happen.
Right. I mean, but it's just funny that this person's been having a freaking... It just had been told to me that there was a meltdown happening tonight. And I was like, oh, what about? And it's like, oh, it's about this hand coming out of the dirt. And it's like, well, clearly that's pretend, right? I just can't handle this kind of thing. So anyway, I'm going to talk to you about something that, oh no, I'm stuck on something because I want to transition smoothly and I can't because it's not going to let me. Okay, I'm going to do it anyway. This is something I talked about in Tell Me Something Weird, which is a podcast I used to do with somebody I used to be friends with. And I'm going to promote it on the Tell Me Something Weird page because I'm an admin and I can do whatever I want. And you might have...
The show is called Cool and Passive Aggressive Punishment.
I love the name of our podcast. And I'm sorry because I'm very drunk. Anyway, this is a story I've done before. And I'm sorry if you've heard it before, everybody. But I love this story. And it's about the bystander effect. And it's about this woman who was murdered in the 60s. And all of this happened because I happened to be on Netflix one day. And it was like suggestions because you have problems with watching a lot of murder things. Because that is my deal. And I hate that because true crime is like, oh, true crime is the big thing right now. But anyway, I do like it. So... this is the story of Kitty Genovese and the bystander effect. And if you don't know what the bystander effect is, tell me what
Yes.
what you think
the bystander effect is the this sociological phenomenon where people are less inclined to help out a stranger or somebody around them because there's this assumption that somebody else will do it. People, if somebody is hurt in public, like people might not call 911, they might not call the police or the fire department if it's needed. If someone sounds like they're in trouble, people think, well, someone else is going to do that. And so what ends up happening is that nobody does anything. Is that close? That's
exactly it. The problem with the bystander effect in this case, which has... Okay, let me just talk about the story. You got it exactly right. So Kitty Genovese was this girl born in Brooklyn, New York. She was raised Catholic. She was a good girl, but she turned out to not be into dudes in a time when it was not terribly cool to feel that way about guys. So... oh my God. Okay. I didn't know this part of the story, and I just happened to catch this. After her mother witnessed a murder, they moved to Connecticut. So there's no follow-up on that, but apparently
that's just exposition.
Kitty Genovese, who is oddly significant for a lot of reasons. Her mom witnessed a murder. They moved to Connecticut. She had recently graduated from high school, and she decided to stay in Brooklyn and live with her grandparents. And
wait, okay, hold on. So she's how old at this point?
Oh my God! Well, she must be 17 or 18.
So her mom is like, if I see one more murder, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna go to Connecticut.
And guess what? Here's what's crazy: is the last time I covered the story, I did not know that Kitty Genovese, who was a lesbian, when she was 18 or 19, she got married and then had the marriage annulled like the same year. So, okay, so we've got this young woman who later in life we become established is not into guys at all, but at some point right after she graduated from high school was like, I'm going to get married, I'm going to live with my grandparents till that happens. Because at that point, they wouldn't be doing what we are doing, which is
living in sin,
like big time.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, her parents saw one too many murders, and that's too bad because of what's going to happen. All right, so she starts working, blah blah blah. You know, she's young and picking up whatever job she can. It's the late 50s, so there's a huge social shift happening in the United States. You know, we're evolving into a post-Mad Men world, right? She becomes a bartender, and she was arrested for bookmaking, as she had been taking bets on horses from bar patrons.
Okay, I have follow-up questions.
I love this.
The first of which, bookmaking? Is that a phrase that describes something other than what it sounds like?
Yes. And I don't want to click on it, but bookmaking has its own thing on Wikipedia. Bookmaking is a process by which you are taking, you know, like you are, is it called a booker?
A bookie? I was saying, is that the verb of what a bookie does?
Because now I'm working it. Because now I'm a librarian.
Yeah,
so
I was like,
what do
she's
I
in
know?
her house making books. Like the law doesn't allow that. Okay, so she was like a bookie.
Yeah, she was a bookie. Okay. She was, and I'm sure, like for her,
so
it was.
She's bartending, so she's like sliding down the bar and being like, "Boy, like, have you seen number 3 up here? Oh boy, I would." That's where I'd put my money, and then just dips away.
Sure. So she moves. So we've got Kitty, right? Kitty is a cool chick. And she gets arrested with her girlfriend. They're each fined $50 and she loses her job. So she gets another job at another bar. And so she wanted to open an Italian restaurant, so she starts working a ton And clearly that's not going to happen. But in any case, she gets a nicer apartment in this place called the QKEW Gardens. All right. So I know about this story because did I already talk about The Witness? Okay. So one day I was bored and like, what's on Netflix? And I stumbled upon this documentary called The Witness, which was made by Kitty Genovese's brother. Kitty Genovese's brother was interested in this idea of the bystander effect, which at this point, all we know about the bystander effect is what you have said, and we are going to accept that as truth. And Kitty Genovese's case is what created the bystander effect incorrectly. So I watched The Witness and saw from the get-go what was wrong with this case, and then I learned the case. So I'm going to tell you about what happened, what the public perception was, and what the truth of it is, okay? So 2:30 in the morning, 1964. Kitty's leaving the bar. Okay, that's about 2:30 in the morning. That's about right time to be leaving a bar, right? When you're working the close shift. She drives home. She has a red Fiat, which I already...
The list of mental notes I'm making for this woman. So she's leaving her bartending job to go home to her
girlfriend,
her gay lover in the Kew Garden, thinking she's got a cooked book in her back pocket. She's thinking of Italian restaurants, and she's driving a red Fiat.
Yeah, don't...
If I got all that right.
Don't find her... I know. She's dead, so don't get too attracted to her.
Those are all the checked every box. Like,
I know. I am in front of you, though, okay? So she's at a traffic light. She wants to turn onto Hoover Avenue, which is a street right by the Kew Gardens. There's a guy named Winston Moseley. He's sitting in a parked car, and he sees her doing this, right? So she gets home around 3:15. She parks her car, and she's only like 100 feet from her apartment door in an alleyway at the rear of the building. She's walking toward the apartment complex. We have to remember Moseley. He had followed her home. Of course, she doesn't know. I mean, it's New York City, and even at that time of day, I have to imagine this isn't like driving in Eau Claire at that time of day. There's still probably some traffic, so you wouldn't be like, oh no, somebody's following me. You're just like, I'm in my Fiat and going to her girlfriend, and this guy fucking just saw her at a stoplight, which is what freaks me out more than anything, because the idea of just, random violence is the most terrifying thing. And, I've had a little of that in my family. So the idea of just randomly deciding, oh, I'm going to pick you. So anyway, he saw her just turn at a stoplight, and that was all. And she gets to her home. She's walking towards her apartment complex. This guy gets out of his vehicle. He parked at a corner bus stop. He has a hunting knife, and he starts following her, right? So he starts to approach her, Kitty, and she runs towards the front of the building, and he starts running after her. He overtakes her, and he stabs her twice in the back. She screams, "Oh my God, he stabbed me, help me." Several neighbors, because this is like a complex kind of like ours, where, there's a lot of buildings together. Some people heard her, but not everybody recognized that as a call for help. And I can identify with that here because sometimes I've been outside smoking or whatever with our neighbor Pam or you or somebody, and you'll hear something and you'll be like, what the fuck was that? And then you're like, oh, it's ball players in Steinfield, or it's a dumpster or whatever. So when one of the neighbors shouts at the attacker, "Let that girl alone." Now you have to realize it's early in the morning, it's dark. All they hear is somebody yelling, just commotion. Maybe they looked outside. certainly they probably didn't see like stabbing. They just saw something and were like, get away from her, you know. So that guy runs away. Moseley runs away. And so Kitty, twice stabbed now, she makes her way to the rear entrance of her building, and she's really injured and also out of the way of witnesses, but she's still alive. So people watched this guy get into his car and he drove away. And they were like, oh, this is a time when like the idea of just a lover's quarrel was still a real thing. Do you know what I mean by that?
We're not quite out of the Mad Men era. Like,
yeah, which you do need to watch. But yes, that's exactly true. There was a time when you would see a guy smack a woman and you'd be like, oh, they're just having a lover's quarrel. Yeah, and it wasn't like, oh my God, that's a problem. It was more like, oh, those two will figure it out later, you know?
I mean, I can take a guess where the story's headed, so we're very quickly running out of runway to make jokes. But it's a bit like, you know, just a lover, like, you know, the husband, like a couple stabbings, like it's not my place. It's not my place to...
What happens next is my worst fucking nightmare. Like, this is truly my worst nightmare. Because this guy, what I get fixated on, okay, I gotta move past it. What I get fixated on when I think about the story is the fact that if this was me, like let's say I'm walking somewhere, blah, 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 and I get stabbed and somebody interferes. They don't really know what they're interfering in because it's early morning. They just hear yelling and somebody yells, let that girl alone. Because, yeah, there was a time when it was like, oh, that boy is smacking her around a little too much or whatever. And it wasn't.
I mean, I would say if the neighbors couldn't see, just kind of heard some commotion, like the person who just has a cursory sort of gestures, like, well, I'll give him a, like, hey, leave that girl alone. Just, you know, just in case. Like, that's
yeah, and
that's a pretty great thing to do.
Nobody really heard her yell what she was yelling, right? And, oh, okay, I got to get past this nightmare. So there's people are like, okay, he left her alone, whatever. So he gets away. Kitty is like slowly making her way to her apartment where her girlfriend lives. They have a nice little life. They won't open this Italian restaurant, whatever. This part's my worst nightmare, and this is why I had to do the story again, even though I had done it with Tell Me Something Weird. This is a new thing. Okay, he comes back 10 minutes later. He puts a hat on. He searches systematically the parking lot, the train station, and an apartment complex. He eventually finds Kitty, who is barely conscious, and she's lying in a hallway at the back of the building where a locked door has prevented her from going inside. So it would be like us coming home to that outside door when it's actually shut and not just like from warping and whatever open. Because we live in a secured building, in quotes. Lately, the door's been open a lot because of the weather and it's kind of warped. She had a similar situation. Her door was not warped. That was her only way of her not being able to get in her place because she's been stabbed twice. And you might be like, oh, twice, you know, there's rappers who have been stabbed like 10 times. Well, this was from the back, and I'm sure it was in her lungs. You know, it was not a good situation, right?
That's terrifying. The other terrifying thing is I can't imagine the kind of person who would do that,
God.
Get chased off, and then
I know
be like, give it 10. I'll do a lap around the block, and like the arrogance to come back, and then to be right, to think that like I'll probably be fine, like that.
It's so bad. Okay. So he's out of the view of the street, and those who have maybe heard or seen any sign of that initial attack, those people did not know that was an attack. You know, comes at her again. So this poor woman, this is like, maybe at some point I'll be able to abandon this story, but I saw the documentary. I did it on Tell Me Something Weird, and now I'm doing it again. The idea that this poor woman was lying there thinking, okay, I'm to this locked door. Maybe somebody at some point is going to open it and I'll get inside and I'll be okay. You know, somebody will call the ambulance and I'll go to the hospital, whatever. I can't imagine that Kitty was thinking in her head that this guy would come back, but he does. He stabs her a bunch more times. He rapes her. He takes $49 from her and he runs away. These attacks spanned a half hour total, and the knife wounds in her hand suggested that she attempted to defend herself from him. So there was a neighbor. Her name was Sophia Farrar. You know, like we have a neighbor who maybe didn't even know any of this was going on because she was sleeping. But at some point, she opens her door and, you know, maybe she heard the attack that happened subsequently, and she holds her in her arms, and that's where Kitty dies, is being held by this neighbor that had never really known her. So records of the earliest calls to the police are unclear, and we're not given a high priority because we have no 911 at this point. We just have calling the police station. The incident occurred 4 years before 911 would come around. One witness said his father called the police after the initial attack and reported that a woman was beat up but got up and was staggering around a few minutes after the final attack. Another witness, Carl Ross, called two friends for advice on what to do, the second of whom called the third friend, who then called the police, who arrived at the scene within minutes of this call. Kitty was picked up by an ambulance at 4:15 a.m. and died en route to the hospital. So what happened was this thing happened, and it was not, for New York City, a very big story, right? I mean, she was stabbed. I don't know, a lot of people die in New York City, and it was a row, you know, it was apartment buildings, just a row. So the New York Times 2 weeks later publishes an article claiming that 38 witnesses saw or heard an attack, but none of them called the police or came to her aid. None. That's like us with all of our neighbors. It would be like including everybody and saying that nobody did anything. So that incident prompted inquiries into what became known as the bystander effect, or the Genovese syndrome, and the murder became a staple of American psychology textbooks for the next 4 decades. The problem is, so this case became the staple for everything, you know, psych textbooks, whatever, as the idea of what you said about the bystander effect. The problem is that it's not true. So as a result of Kitty's murder, that's how the 911 system becomes a thing, because of her murder, eventually, because politics is glacial as far as change. You know, it takes 3 or 4 years, but eventually they develop a 911 system in New York, and then everybody adopts it. And the bystander effect becomes a thing in psychology textbooks. The problem is that the bystander effect didn't happen here, but the effects of it still linger. And we all know the bystander effect, and we don't realize what it's referencing, which is the Kitty Genovese case, which was not the bystander effect. The New York Times decided to write this story in which they cite it as all these neighbors, but that's not correct. Reporters at a competing news organization discovered in 1964 that the article was inconsistent with the facts, but they were unwilling at the time to challenge the New York Times because they were afraid, because the New York Times is like...
swings a big dick around town.
Yeah, it's like Mark Zuckerberg.
Also, I don't know if
Zuckerberg.
It was a thing
you know what I mean? It's like, oh, what? I'm going to take on Apple or whatever. You know?
I don't know if that article was the first to suggest the idea, or if this was a thing that people could tell you, like the idea of what the bystander effect is, like that, well, they just editorialized a story to describe something everybody knows, or if because if they were the first people to suggest it, like, well, they were very fortunate that they made up something that has been proven out by science since that. Like,
yeah.
Perhaps they didn't interview 38 people and come to these conclusions, but what they were describing is a very real thing.
The bystander effect was not. The bystander effect was not a thing in words before this happened, okay? And what's crazy is that even though it's been proven to not be what it was, it's persisted in psychology textbooks and such. So what happened was, okay, there was a news organization that was competing in 1964, and I won't get into all of that because this is already going long. But anyway, they were like, wait a minute, this doesn't read correctly. But they didn't want to challenge the editor of the Times, who was this guy named Abe Rosenthal. And I could get into all of that, but I won't. But in 2007, let's fast forward, there was an article in a journal called The American Psychologist, which found, quote, no evidence for the presence of 38 witnesses, or that witnesses observed the murder, or that witnesses remained inactive. In 2016, we have to remember this was back in the 60s, 64, the New York Times called its own reporting flawed, stating that the original story, quote, grossly exaggerated the number of witnesses and what they had perceived. So, did you hear that? I just bumped that. Sorry, everybody. What happened when I watched The Witness was the brother of Kitty Genovese, in the midst of all this coming out, wanted to reach out to the neighbors. And if you're familiar with the idea of a property being rent controlled, in New York City, people can live in the same apartment for literally their whole lives because it's rent controlled, which means their rent doesn't go up.
$300 for an apartment in New York for 60 years. Yeah.
Yeah. So there were people who lived there when Kitty was there who were still there just a few years ago, who were still alive. And he wanted to know what they had truly seen and or heard, because he wanted to feel assured that the bystander effect in this case was not correct. Right? So that's what I had watched before I researched this. And what he discovered was knocking on doors of elderly people who'd either not heard it or had called the police.
I was going to say, is that like, was the New York Times incorrect in that they just made some assumptions without backing them up? Or would we find out that every neighbor was calling the police and the police force was just not like, equipped to, respond to a crime within half an hour?
Because there was no 911.
Right.
So what happened was it would be like somebody calling the police department and saying, hey, I heard screaming and I don't know what's going on, but it doesn't sound good. And it was just a regular call, and it was just documented like a regular call. And so this happened from many of the neighbors who were like, I heard that. I called the police. I called the police station. I said I heard something weird, and they wrote it down, and there was just nothing done about it because there was no 911. So it was like cops in New York City, they've got other shit to deal with, right? I mean,
so, well, this is actually really interesting because I'm making an assumption here that the bystander effect was in fact studied properly and proven. I'm assuming that's true. The fact that we know it as a term today, like if it was based on this and only this, and we like, am I correct in assuming that this is a real phenomena?
It's a real phenomenon. The thing that sucks about all of it,
but it was like
based.
It's based on
a false thing.
But not only that, like, this is the kind of thing that where you would expect this would happen, but in fact, like, this was an exception in that everybody, like, did the right thing. That's even more fascinating that
what sucks about the bystander effect is that all of us have accepted it's real. I have never witnessed it personally, but
I mean, are you like
maybe I'm
have you ever, like, I mean,
I guess I
like
just witnessed a T-bone accident the other day.
You hear something, you maybe go outside, you wait for a follow-up.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay.
That's the thing, is because when you describe what this is to somebody, it puts this image in your mind of all these neighbors kind of like crossing their arms and being like, fuck that person. And that's not really what's happening. It's everybody kind of individually deciding like, well, it's probably fine. It's not my problem. Like, everyone kind of does a little bit, and it snowballs into it, you know.
Yeah. And a lot of people did call the police station. And just as it is here, just like you said, you hear something and you're not really sure. And, the bystander effect should not be based on this case, but it is, because that's not what occurred. Like NPR in 2014, there was a book called Kitty Genovese, The Murder, the Bystanders, the Crime That Changed America. This guy's name's Kevin Cook. He says 38 witnesses. That was the story that came from the police in the New York Times. 38
that
witnesses.
That actually explains a lot. So I was going to say, if it wasn't the neighbors that were at fault, like what the story is, like, I'm not mad if this was the foundation for this effect, even if it wasn't true. Like, that doesn't make me mad. But what does kind of upset me is that it skips over the actual missing link in this chain, which was that the police were not responsive enough that it allowed this guy to come back, and
also the police wanted to find this guy, and they wanted there to be public outcry about it, right? So what's crazy about the story that this Kevin Cook from NPR did in 2014, over the course of many months of research, I wound up finding a document that was a collection of the first interviews. Oddly enough, there were 49 witnesses. I was puzzled by that until I added up the entries themselves. Some of them were interviews with 2 or 3 people who lived in the same apartment. I believed that some harried civil servant gave that number to the police commissioner, who gave it to Rosenthal from the New York Times, and it entered the modern history of America after that. So, you must realize that beyond anything, the number of witnesses was inaccurate. We had 3 people. It'd be like this place has 64 units or whatever. And you have to realize that there's
6,000 people living here.
Yeah.
Under the table, yeah.
Right. So it's like number one, that was super inflated.
Half of that is students crammed into tiny apartments. The other half is people who are living in our basement that we haven't discovered yet.
Yeah. Yeah. The Chicago Tribune began an article titled Justice in the Wrong Hands by saying 20 years later in the same city, a man known in headlines as the subway vigilante and the death wish gunman shoots 4 teenage boys in a subway, in a disturbing number of voices expressed delight. Miss Genovese screamed for more than half an hour. The public reaction is disbelief that law enforcement authorities will protect people against street crime, and its display of belief that the rule of force is all that is left. So there's this lingering idea of, oh my God, this woman was killed and nobody cared about it. And the fact is that several people and I have to stop, but several people called the police. It was not documented, or it was documented casually as like, oh, somebody said there was a scream in Q's Gardens or whatever. And people cared because the brother of Kitty, when he met with people, they were like, oh my God, I was asleep, or oh my God, I called the cops because I heard something.
That's what I was wondering, if you're a police responder in New York City, like, and this call is one that gets put in a notebook and filed away. Like, what are the calls that they take seriously in New York? Is it like, the warriors are passing through? Yeah. Shit, get a squad down there. Like, what are the calls they are taking if not this?
What's really sucked about all of this is the fact that ultimately there was a murder of a woman that wasn't of a terrible amount of interest to anybody, and suddenly it was like, oh, how can we generate some interest in this? And how many different units are facing Kitty's apartment? And that means there's 38 units, there's 30 bystanders, whatever, and not taking into account that people called the police and all of this stuff. And ultimately, the bystander effect might be correct. It is correct. To some extent, the bystander effect is not because of Kitty Genovese, which is the cited reason for the bystander effect in psychology textbooks still. And like the list of things that have adopted this, like Perry Mason, Law and Order, the Boondock Saints references Genovese's murder in the opening credits during the church sermon. History's Mysteries, Investigation Discovery, the 2015 film, which I watched, The Witness. There is a season of Girls, which is called Hello Kitty. It follows the characters as they navigate through an interactive theatrical version of her murder. There's also a list of literature. There's a list of music. Because on the surface, this is a very romantic idea, right? Like the idea, oh my God, there was this young, vibrant woman who was a bartender and a lesbian and not unattractive anyway, that was murdered and nobody cared about it, and that's not exactly true.
I feel like it's the mistake in this historical telling doesn't upset me. Like, I feel like I would be upset if I was one of those neighbors. Like, I would probably take it personally. But it only upsets me insofar as I imagine some police chief being like, yeah, 38 neighbors. They just, I guess, we're not human beings anymore. But
yeah,
it's a very real thing. And that's why people, I don't know if you've heard this, but if you're ever a witness at some kind of accident, if you're the first person to run up to somebody who's lying on the ground, they tell you to point at somebody and say, you call 911, because if you single someone out, they will do it. Everyone wants to help. But if you don't, if you just say someone call 911, everybody will assume somebody else does, not because they're bad people, but because it's just human nature. And also I feel like I was trying to think of a good example, and nothing really came to mind, but I feel like everybody has been in a situation like that where there are these unspoken rules of being in public, being in society, where you if you're a normal, respectful person, you keep to yourself. You don't bother strangers. You don't want to make a fuss. Nobody wants to be the person who makes a scene. Mm-hmm. And so when something happens, everyone is kind of like, well, I'm not gonna. I don't know. 1,000 prank shows have shown this, where some guy comes in for an interview and they just fill the room with smoke, and all the other actors in the room don't move, so that person doesn't move. Everybody, all it takes is one sociopath to abuse those rules, and they can walk out of a department store with a TV and nobody does anything, because everyone's like, well, I get no one else is saying anything, so I guess it's fine.
Yeah. Right.
It's a terrifying loophole in the compassion of humans. The assumption that well, I don't see sirens, I don't see panic, so I guess.
Yeah. And in the 60s, this was before there was police scanner apps and Facebook pages devoted to this. So this was a completely different time. And this was Kitty Genovese's case is what inspired New York to adopt a 911 system, which then obviously you are listening to this and thinking to yourself, well, I have 911. I believe everybody has it. And the part of the reason why they have it is because of Kitty Genovese's case. The idea being that people called and said, well, I'm hearing something weird, but it was treated as like, okay, thanks, I'm going to write it down. And the reality of it being that, like, if some of these callers had 911 at that time, they would have said, I'm hearing things that are very troubling. I think you need to come here. And the police would have come. And in that world, maybe Kitty would have survived instead of escaping an attacker the first time, thinking in her head, I'm okay. He's gone. And then he shows up again, which is like the worst nightmare, right? And she's outside a locked door and he murders her. And so that's that's a huge reason why 911 is a thing, because of this case. So the bystander effect, correct thing, wrong case, decided. This guy gets caught, just to tell you. So we've got this guy who I don't even want to say his name because what a piece of shit, but his first name is Winston. But he gets caught because, let's see, I forget. He's arrested for suspected robbery 6 days after he does this to her.
He tries to rob a convenience store and get shooed away, and like 20 minutes later, like, oh, I'll give it another shot. Like, well,
he's got a TV in the back of his car, in the trunk of his car. He's driving a Corvair, which is kind of a hot little car. It's a white Chevy Corvair, which is the kind of car which probably even at that time was like, oh, look at that fucker in that car. We should pull him over because he's no good. So
are you sure it's not because it's 1960 and his name is Winston? So I'm gonna take a
you're right.
Guess. Like,
you're right.
Might have got pulled over for other reasons.
Yeah, you're right. A detective recalls that a white car had been reported by some of the witnesses in Genovese's murder. He informs another detective. They start questioning him. He admits to the murder of Genovese and two other women who had been shot and burned to death in their apartment. One of them was shot and burned to death. Another had been killed in her parents' home. One was 15. So he was what's considered a serial killer, because once you go over 2 and there's a certain amount of time, you're a serial killer. So, yeah, that's the bystander effect that never was but is, thanks to Kitty Genovese. And if you have Netflix, you should watch The Witness, because it's quite sweet, because her brother is very dedicated to wanting to connect with these people and really understand what happened versus what he had read. And it's really quite good. So
I remember telling you the story when I was walking through a urban park here in Eau Claire, and I walked past a porta potty and heard the shouting of 2 people inside a porta potty as I passed it, and one man yelling at another man inside this porta potty saying, like, I told you I didn't want to see you in here again. And I'll tell you what,
if you have it locked, you shouldn't have that problem.
I mean, so many questions arise from it, and I didn't get answers because I put my head down and got the fuck out of there. It's the stakes clearly not as high, but like, that's like, my first thought was like, I need to get away from this. I don't want to be in the perimeter of what's about to spill out of this.
I can't blame you. Because, when you're in a porta potty, it should be locked. And then it's like, oh no, what are you people up to?
Yeah, it's yeah, it was the incredulous tone of like, not, why are you in this porta potty with me? It was like, not again. Like, oh, come on.
So then it's like, what's going on in there? So anyway, that's my story. So how are we going to end this thing?
Tell me something weird shows I've heard. Like your serial killer stories they're aged long enough that there's it doesn't feel so heavy and tragic.
Because yes, I did this other podcast, and I don't want to do the quote ray of sunshine because I always sort of hated that name anyway. But yeah, now you have experienced the heaviness of kind of my stories.
I don't like the term ray of sunshine, but I see the need for it. Like,
yeah. Yeah. So like, do you have any kind of fun stuff to lift us up at the end of this?
Are you prepared to be mayor of Hell, Michigan on your birthday next year?
On my 41st birthday? 41st.
You will be mayor of Hell, Michigan for one day.
Are you going to do it for me?
It's done. And there's a lot of like t-shirts and like koozies and magnets and like shit that comes with it.
Oh
and a
my God.
And,
are you serious?
Yeah.
I have known about Hell, Michigan since I was in high school. Like, it was a running thing between my best friend before he died, Eric, and I, how we wanted desperately to go to Hell, Michigan, because it's not that far, and that we're in Wisconsin.
That's in on the joke. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Feels like a good surprise to spoil for our first episode. And if you're that into it, yeah, we can go to Hell, Michigan.
I had no idea that you did this. So, yeah. Okay, well, maybe for our honeymoon, we could go and do some geocaching.
Well, not yet.
I'm always the mayor.
It was supposed to be a surprise, and then I was like, well, eventually I have to tell you because I want you to be able to prepare for whatever. Like, you'll get occasional phone calls throughout the day asking you to make decisions.
Oh my God.
I want you to be prepared for it. I was Googling it, and I saw some Twitter accounts of other people who were mayor for a day, and they were this guy who was he banned radical heterosexuality in Hell, Michigan.
I want to ban toxic masculinity. So that's where we're going to leave it. We're cool and unusual punishment. And
I mean, we don't have anything yet, so
bye.